For the past few days, I've been struggling with modeling a cereal. The story begins when I wanted to create a tutorial on how to fill a container with Tyflow, and what could be better than filling a bowl with cereals. So after making a test fill with the torus, it was time to change them to an actual cereal model. Here's what I've done. So here we have a torus. First I added a turbo smooth to be able to add extra details to it, and then added a small noise, and after that a bigger one, and finally another turbo smooth to smooth out the surface. And the result was not bad for the beginning, but I knew something wasn't right. So I did some research, and after watching some references, I figure out the problem with my model is it doesn't have holes. So I need to dig some holes. But how? First thing came to my mind was to scatter some spheres on the torus and use Boolean to subtract the holes. I used Tyflow and scattered some sphere on the model. So here's the result after the Boolean. He added a smooth to fix some smoothing group problem, set it to auto, added a retopology to turn it into quads, and then turbo smooth and noise. The result was not bad, and I liked the holes, but I wanted more, and I wanted the holes to be more procedural. I even tried to turn it into some kind of shell and see whether it works or not, so I deleted the Boolean parts and then added a shell, and I should say it doesn't work at all, and just reminded me an episode from Tom and Jerry. So that's why I've switched to displacement. And I don't mean the material displacement, but the displacement on the model. In order to add it, first you need a high poly mesh, and I mean as high poly as possible, and then go and add a displace, and you can add your maps to the map slot. For example, I will add a noise, a general one, to the map slot, and you can see by changing the strengths we can add the displacement to the object. It looks like nothing happened, but because the size is so large and we need to decrease it, I will change it to something like 43, and here you can see the effect of the object. As you can see, we have some distortion here, and the reason for that is it's using the UV mapping here of the displacement, and it's applying it on the object. And if I change it, you can see it will change, but I will use the existing mapping and it will solve the problem. The reason to that is when you create a default object in 3ds Max, it will automatically generate UV mapping, and if I add the unwrap UVW, you can see it here. So by choosing the use existing mapping, you can use this existing UVW, and in this case it works the best. So let's change it to something like 50 and invert the displacement, and by changing these numbers you can see we can achieve some amazing results. So what I've done here, I used the composite map and applied different maps to it. And here's the result. Let me enable them one by one so you can see how they apply different details to the model. One thing I need to mention, because there were so many maps that I wanted to test and try on the model and see the effect, I decided to make my model a little bigger, because when I added a map, I had to make it super small because the model was super small, about 1.5 centimeters. So this was a little time consuming. And this was not only for the displacement, I also had to do the same process for the material, and because I wanted to make a procedural material, I had to every time scale down the map size. So I decided to totally increase the size of the serial 10 times bigger than the actual model. And I figured out this was not a really good idea because when I scaled down the model, it would destroy the material. The material was big, but the model was small. So I decided to stick with the actual size of the serial and scale up everything else like the bowl or the box of the cereal. And here came another problem. I started the simulation with default torus because my model was so heavy, so I couldn't tweak the settings. So I created some torus with the size of my current model, which was about 100 centimeters, and the result looked like it was captured in slow-mo, as you can see. The reason for that was the size of my models were not accurate, so I had to make them smaller for an accurate simulation. And that wasn't the only problem. When I've done, for example, the simulation, I wanted to change my model with the actual model, this would happen. So when you're working with the Tyflow, always count the polys, especially when you're working with the physics on heavy scenes. And as you noticed, I had to decrease the iteration of the Turbo Smooth, and the model was losing all of its details. So that was a huge failure. So that was the time I knew that I have to do what I don't want to do. And that's switching to ZBrush for adding detail, but I didn't know how to use it. So what do you do when you don't know how to use the software? You go to the YouTube and search for the tutorial, and I found something super useful from the Flip Normal and learned ZBrush in 1 hour. And I should say, if you want to add detail to your objects, you have to learn ZBrush. An amount of detail you can add to your objects is insane. After painting the detail by hand, I tried to add extra details by surface noise, and I don't know why, but I again forgot to count the poly, and I've created something super heavy, and when I wanted to export it to Substance, I couldn't. So again, I returned to ZBrush and used Dynamesh to reduce the size of the model and created something a little low poly that was not, again, really low poly, but better than the previous high poly models. And then I exported my model as an OBJ to the Substance Painter. And the reason why I used Substance Painter was, first, I would be able to add details by hand wherever I want. And secondly, the reason I didn't went fully procedural was I could be able to use my model in other projects and scale it without a problem. And finally, in the Substance Painter, for the diffuse map, I used as you can tell, bread texture. So I bring the texture into the Photoshop and mask out unwanted parts and created some seamless bread texture and finalize it in the Substance Painter. And finally, in the 3ds Max, I've tweaked the materials by adding some noise and translucency to the material and created 3 types of materials with 3 colors to add variation in the final render. And at the end, when I wanted to render the animation, I couldn't because the scene was a little heavy, so Octane couldn't handle it. And after several crashes, I decided to bake the Tyflow simulation to objects. And this resolved the issue, and I would render the animation without a problem. If you don't have time to model a serial, you can download the serial model and this scene from my Patreon. I will put the link in description, so you can use this serial model in your projects. And if you want me to create more of these tutorials, please subscribe to the channel, like this video, and ladies and gentlemen, here's the final results. Don't forget to turn on the bell notification, as I'm using this serial to create some kind of a advertising project in the next tutorial, and I will see you in the next one.